Dust drifted like smoke over Eagle Pass as shutters clattered and boots thudded on warped boards. And Ethan Cole said, "Storms moved on, but it left teeth." The saloon lamp hissed, throwing honey light on cracked glass and tired faces. A sudden scream split the hush, sharp as a whip crack, and Jesse Pike said, "That came from the street." The doors slammed open, and a man stumbled in, soaked crimson to the ribs, trailing rain and mud. He fell across the piano, and the sick chord rang like a bell at a funeral. Ethan crossed the room, steady and cold, and said, "Easy, friend. Breathe." The stranger's eyes shone with desert fever as he gasped, "The pass is away." Clara Monroe caught the fallen lamp before it shattered and said, "Who did this to you?" Wind pressed the walls and rattled bottle glass like bones in a jar. The man shook, blood beating through his fingers, and he said, "Not who, what?" Amos Reed rose from shadow, caned steps slow, and said, "Some debts ride on the wind." Thunder rolled above the town like wagon wheels on stone. The stranger clutched Ethan's coat and rasped. Silas Crane dug where he shouldn't, and now the ground wants it back. Every face tilted toward the door, as if expecting the night to answer. Ethan felt the old scar burn and said, "If the past is coming, it can find me standing." The storm's tail dragged east, leaving a sky the color of old pewter, and Ethan Cole said, "Tell me where the past bid you." Thomas Hale coughed hard, spattering the floor with rust, and whispered of dynamite sunk into a limestone throat. He said the earth bucked like a dying bull, and spat bones no one had buried in living memory. Jesse Pike paced the doorway and said, "Bones don't rise unless someone digs their bed." Amos Reed's cane clicked once, and he said, "Silas Crane buys maps, others burned." Clara Monroe knelt with clean cloth and steady hands, and she said, "Hold on, Thomas, look at me." The saloon's faces pulled tight, stretched between fear and hunger, and the lamp chimed with moth wings. Outside, boots drummed as riders crossed the street like a rumor. Thomas gripped Ethan's sleeve and said the past carried a name older than the river, a name that cut the tongue. He swore he heard chanting where only wind should speak. Ethan felt his past uncoil, slow as a rattler in shade, and said, "If Crane woke it, he'll answer." The piano stood silent now, a coffin with keys, and the room waited for a verdict. Thunder muttered one last warning and went quiet. Jesse Pike edged into the street, eyes on the courthouse spire, and said, "No sign of Crane's riders, but the town smells of them." Wind combed grit across the boardwalk and lifted torn, wanted sheets. Ethan Cole followed, boots whispering, and said, "Crane keeps quiet when he sharpens knives." The night held that tight theater silence before the first line lands. A church bell clanged once as if by mistake, and a dog answered from somewhere behind the blacksmith. Clara Monroe joined them with a lantern tucked low, and she said, "If there are bones, there should be names." Amos Reed pointed his cane toward Eagle Pass Canyon and said, "The ground remembers what men deny." Jesse glanced at Ethan and said, "You ever think about leaving this place to the buzzards?" Ethan said, "I tried once, the road turned me back." The saloon door creaked behind them as the townspeople drifted to the edges like moths too shy of flame. A rider paused at the far end, tipping his hat without warmth, and moved on. The street felt like a fuse in search of a match, and every step wrote a dare. They reached the assay office, shutters latched and ledger light dead, and Amos Reed said, "Crane's people weigh more than ore here." A faint glow seeped under the door like a secret refusing to die. Ethan Cole rapped once, calm as a judge, and a voice said, "Closed for accounts." Jesse Pike smiled thin and said, "Open for truth then." The lock turned with a reluctant sigh, and a clerk stared at them with practiced fear. He said, "I see nothing, I record less." Clara Monroe set a coin on the counter, bright as a tiny sun, and said, "Then see this." The clerk's eyes twitched toward a side ledger bound in red twine. Ethan lifted it, feeling the weight of names that limped and bled. Inside, shipments marked for Crane crossed with parcels bound for the canyon, signed by hands that no longer wrote. Amos said, "He's feeding the pass with what it wants." The clerk swallowed and said, You didn't hear it from me." Outside, the wind rose, tugging paper like restless fingers. Ethan closed the ledger and said, "We'll hear it from him." They stepped back into the street as a lone carriage rolled from the courthouse, wheels whispering like secrets, and Silas Crane sat inside with a smile that never reached his eyes. He raised 2 fingers in greeting, as if blessing a congregation he intended to tithe dry. "Ethan Cole," said Evening. "Mayor Tor." Silas Crane said, "Evening, Mr. Cole. Busy night for saints and scavengers." Jesse Pike shifted, measuring distances the way a hawk measures fields. Clara Monroe said, "Men are hurt at the pass." Silas Crane said, "Men choose where to place their hands, and the earth does as it pleases." Amos Reed tapped his cane and said, "You stirred something that doesn't sleep easy." Silas let the smile thin and said, "Progress rattles bones, but it builds a future." The driver snapped the reins, and the carriage eased on, lanterns trailing like cold stars. Ethan watched the wheels smear light across puddles and said, "We'll speak again where the road runs out." The town breathed shallow, as if waiting for someone else to take the first full breath. Somewhere far off, a coyote yipped, and the sound felt like a signature. The saloon air turned heavier than smoke as Thomas Hale's ragged breath grew shallow, and Ethan Cole said, "Tell us clean before the dark takes you." Thomas clutched his chest, eyes wide with terror, and he whispered of chants in stone hollows. Jesse Pike leaned forward and said, "Words that ain't words, right? Like tongues grinding bone." Thomas nodded weakly, saying he saw fire beneath the canyon and shadows that moved against the flame. Clara Monroe pressed cloth to his wound, her hands firm, and said, "You're not leaving us in riddles." Amos Reed leaned on his cane, gazed deep, and said, "The curse of Eagle Pass was whispered before any of us drew first breath." Outside, shutters cracked in the wind, and the piano keys still carried stains that gleamed like accusation. Thomas said, "The ground split, and something old crawled back." His face twisted in terror as he whispered, "Crane sent men to wake it," and the earth screamed. Ethan's jaw tightened, scar pale in the lamplight, and he said, "If Crane woke what should slept, then he holds fire he can't put out." Thomas's eyes rolled back, and silence fell like a stone in a well. Word spread fast across Eagle Pass, sharper than knives in a poker game, and townspeople whispered by barrels and hitching posts. Ethan Cole walked through the square, coat drawn close, and said, "They already know the curse is loose." Clara Monroe glanced at shuttered shops, her lantern bobbing low, and said, "Fear breeds quicker than truth." Jesse Pike scuffed the dirt with his boot and said, "They'll run before they stand." Amos Reed's eyes roved the faces peeking from half-lit windows, and he said, "Some curses are carried on silence." A boy darted past, clutching a paper marked with red chalk, and vanished into the dark. Murmurs rose like bees in a hive, naming the canyon with cracked voices. Ethan stopped by the well and said, "They smell Crane's shadow over this." Clara said, "Then someone must speak louder than fear." Jesse spat in the dust and said, "Or bleed first to prove it ain't story." The bell tower tolled once without a hand, rattling every window. Ethan looked up and said, "We'll find the truth before the town buries us with it." Silas Crane strode from the courthouse porch as if the ground were his altar, lanterns painting his face in gold and shadow. He said, "Eagle Pass prospers when men keep faith with me." Ethan Cole stepped from the crowd, shoulders squared, and said, "You stirred something that ain't yours to own." Crane's smile bent like a knife, and he said, "Progress takes courage, Cole, and courage leaves blood." Jesse Pike's hand twitched near his belt, and Clara Monroe whispered, "Not now." Amos Reed tapped his cane once and said, "You'll find your courage crumbles when the earth takes its due." Crane's gaze raked the gathered townsfolk, and he said, "Fear makes men obedient." A hush settled heavy as lead, broken only by the sound of hooves in the dark. Ethan's eyes stayed on Crane, and he said, "Obedience ain't the same as respect." Crane laughed low, his silver watch chain glinting, and said, "Respect is for graves, not men who breathe." The air cracked with silence so sharp it burned. Later, by the livery, Clara Monroe stood with arms folded as Ethan Cole checked his revolver under the lamplight. She said, "You can't carry this alone, Ethan." He said, "Every scar I wear says otherwise." Jesse Pike leaned on the post, grin fading, and said, "You sound like you're already dead." Clara stepped closer, her eyes fire bright, and said, "I won't watch you turn stone." Amos Reed approached slowly, voice low, and said, "The past will drown you if you don't share its weight." Ethan snapped the cylinder shut and said, "The past already drowned me once." Clara touched his hand and said, "Then let me be the reason you surface again." Jesse looked away, kicking dust, and muttered, "Hope's a dangerous meal." Amos said, "But it's the only thing that feeds tomorrow." Ethan stared at Clara, silence breaking between them like glass, and he said, "If I fall, promise me you'll burn the canyon to ash." Clara shook her head and said, "I'll promise only to keep you breathing." The night cracked open with a rifle's bark, sharp as lightning, and glass shattered above the mercantile. Townsfolk screamed, scattering into alleys. Ethan and Cole dragged Clara Monroe behind the trough, and he said, "Stay low." Jesse Pike dashed forward, pistol drawn, and said, "I see him on the roof." Amos Reed crouched with a grunt, cane across his knees, and said, "Crane's dogs bite quick." A second shot sparked against the hitch rail, throwing splinters into the dirt. Ethan fired once in reply, muzzle flash searing the dark, and a figure darted across the rooftop like a ghost. Clara gripped Ethan's arm and said, "They'll kill anyone standing near you." Ethan's breath slowed, eyes locked on the roofline, and he said, "Then they'll have to bleed the whole town." The shooter leapt into shadow and vanished with hoofbeats trailing. Silence returned, broken by the sob of a shopkeeper clutching his son. Jesse cursed under his breath and said, "They're testing how quick we'll break." Ethan holstered his pistol slow, jaw tight, and said, "Then we show them we don't." The sheriff's office reeked of dust and rust as Ethan Cole slammed against the bars, shackled by accusations carved from Crane's lies. Sheriff Briggs read charges slow, voice like gravel, and said, "Murder at the pass. Blood on your hands." Ethan's jaw clenched and he said, "You know damn well Crane pulled the strings." Jesse Pike shouted from outside, fists hammering wood, and said, "He was with us when it happened." Clara Monroe stood pale in the doorway, eyes burning, and said, "This is Crane's script, and you're reading it blind." Amos Reed shook his head, cane tapping, and said, "Justice bends where power leans." Crane's men smirked in the shadows, rifles ready, as Ethan's wrists bled against iron cuffs. Ethan said, "You lock me in here, you bury the truth alive." The sheriff lowered his gaze, muttering, "Law and truth, son, it's survival." The air stank of defeat, but Ethan's eyes flared like coal, and he whispered, "Then I'll break the law to set the truth free." Jesse Pike rattled the door from outside, voice cracking with rage, and said, "You can't keep him locked while Crane feasts on our bones." The sheriff growled, "Back off, boy, or I'll give you a cell too." Clara Monroe stepped forward, lantern in hand, and said, "If justice blind, it's because men gouged out its eyes." Ethan Cole gripped the bars, veins straining, and said, "Listen to her, Briggs. You know the pass won't stay quiet." Amos Reed's cane struck the floor like thunder, and he said, "You think iron bars can keep curses from walking?" The sheriff's deputies shifted uneasy, doubt flickering like candlelight in their eyes. Jesse shouted, "You'll regret the day you chained the only man willing to fight for this town." Clara's breath trembled as she said, "Don't you see, they'll kill him in here before dawn." Ethan leaned close, voice low, and said, "They're waiting for me to choke on my silence, but I won't." The air tasted of sweat, fear, and splintered justice. From the corner, a shadow peeled itself into form. Malcolm Vance, Crane's enforcer, eyes black as tar. He said, "Cole don't deserve a trial, he deserves a grave." Ethan Cole locked eyes with him and said, "Funny, Malcolm, I thought you'd already dug plenty." Malcolm smiled like a wolf, scars tugging his lips, and said, "You're just another body on Crane's ledger." Jesse Pike spat through the bars, saying, "You couldn't fight straight if your soul depended on it." Malcolm drew closer, whispering, "Your friend's right. my sole daunt. Clara Monroe's grip tightened on her lantern and she said, "Step back, or I'll blind you with more than light." Amos Reed growled low, saying, "The merciless always choke on their own hunger." Malcolm sneered and said, "We'll see whose throat's cut first." The room vibrated, with the weight of violence coiled too tight. Later, when the deputies dozed, Amos Reed leaned close to Ethan's cell, eyes distant with old ghosts. He said, "The last time I saw Eagle pass bleed, I was younger than Jesse, and the earth opened then too." Ethan said, "You knew this before." Amos nodded, cane trembling, and said, "I buried men who swore the canyon whispered their names." Clara Monroe leaned in, whispering, "Why didn't you tell us?" Amos said, "Because truth makes cowards of crowds, and I'd hoped it'd stay buried." Jesse Pike said, "You carried this secret while Crane carved up the land." Amos' voice cracked. Crane's digging awoke the bones I feared most. Ethan gripped his hand through the bars and said, "Then you'll guide us through it." Amos said, "Guide you, yes, but I can't promise survival." The weight of history pressed heavier than iron, and silence filled the cracks where courage should be. At dawn, a deputy slipped, dropping keys with a clang that rang like prophecy. Ethan Cole caught Amos Reed's gaze, silent understanding forged. Clara Monroe whispered, "We can't waste this chance." Jesse Pike snatched the keys with a grin sharp as a blade and said, "Freedom suits him better than chains." The cell door creaked open, and Ethan stepped into pale light, saying, "Crane thinks the canyon's his weapon, but it'll be his coffin." Amos Reed said, "The canyon don't forgive trespass." Clara Monroe gripped Ethan's arm, eyes fierce, and said, "Then we fight with more than fear." Jesse Pike said, "We fight with fire, steel, and the truth they choke on." Thor stood in the sheriff's office, reborn as a knot of resistance. Outside, the sun broke, copper light spilling across the street like blood warming. Ethan whispered, "Eagle Pass ain't done yet." The night bled into Ethan Cole's mind as he walked the canyon ridge, memory clawing back through smoke and gunfire. He saw the day his brother fell in the war, a bullet meant for him finding softer flesh. Ethan whispered, "I should have been the one." The wind tore through the canyon, carrying echoes of screams that weren't there. Clara Monroe stood behind him, lantern casting trembling light, and said, "You can't keep living in graves." Ethan's fist shook as he said, "Every step I take is over him." Jesse Pike shifted uneasily, muttering, "You fight like he still breathes through you." Amos Reed planted his cane and said, "The dead don't want your chains, Cole, they want your strength." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the weight of guilt grind like stones, and he said, "The past knows me, it's where my sins live." Clara's voice softened, "Then let's bury them for good." The canyon groaned beneath them, as if the earth itself remembered his past. Morning brought no peace, only faces twisted by fear as townsfolk gathered in the square. A shopkeeper hissed, "Cole brought this curse on us," and others nodded. Ethan Cole stood firm, saying, "Crane planted the seed, not me." A woman cried, "But you woke it with your return." Jesse Pike stepped forward, voice hot, and said, "You blame the only man fighting for you." Amos Reed raised his cane, steady, and said, "The earth doesn't curse a man, it curses greed." Murmurs rose like rising smoke, their distrust circling Ethan like wolves. Clara Monroe stepped into the center, voice sharp, "You'll either stand with him or dig your own graves." The crowd shifted, some faces softening, others hardening like stone. Ethan scanned the eyes around him, scar throbbing with each stare, and he said, "If you think I'm the curse, you've already given Crane the rope." The silence that followed was heavier than chains. As the crowd dispersed, Clara Monroe pulled Ethan into the shadow of the church. Her eyes burned and she said, "You can't keep hiding pieces of the truth from me." Ethan's voice cracked, "If you knew the blood I carry, you'd turn away." Clara grabbed his coat, whispering fierce, "I already know, and I'm still here." Ethan swallowed hard, scar tightening, and said, "My brother died in my place, and I let the war make me a ghost." Clara touched his face, eyes wet, and said, Then let me remind you you're still flesh. Jesse Pike lingered by the doorway, pretending not to hear, while Amos Reed muttered, "Secrets rot faster in silence." Ethan's chest heaved as the weight lifted enough to breathe, and he said, "If you're my anchor, then don't let me drift." Clara whispered, "I won't." The church bell hung silent above them, as if holding back its toll. The ambush came sudden by the creek, rifles cracking from the ridge. Jesse Pike cried out as a bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him into the dirt. Ethan Cole dragged him behind a boulder, shouting, "Hold steady." Clara Monroe pressed cloth to Jesse's wound, saying, "You'll live if you stop squirming." Jesse winced, groaning, "Feels like fire chewing me." Amos Reed raised his cane like a staff and said, "Crane's dogs don't know mercy." Shots sparked stone, dirt spraying into their faces. Ethan fired back, muzzle flash searing daylight, and shouted, "Push them off the ridge." Jesse gritted through the pain, firing with his free hand, saying, "They'll wish they finished me." Clara's eyes blazed as she said, "No one finishes us tonight." The creek water churned red with dust as the gunfight raged, echoing through the canyon. When the smoke cleared, silence pressed heavy, broken only by Jesse Pike's ragged breath. Amos Reed stood tall on the creek bank, eyes grim, and said, "This won't be the last ambush." Ethan Cole wiped blood from his cheek, whispering, "He's hunting us like game." Clara Monroe bound Jesse's shoulder tight, saying, "We need safe ground before night falls." Jesse grinned weakly. "Safe ground don't exist, only better targets." Amos tapped his cane into the dirt, muttering, "There's worse coming than bullets." Ethan looked toward the canyon, jaw hard, and said, "Then we take the fight to him." Clara's voice cut firm, "Not before we rest and mend." Jesse spat dust, chuckling, "Guess even ghosts need breath." The creek gurgled quietly, carrying away the red, while the ridge loomed sharp as teeth. "What?" Ethan whispered. "The pass remembers, and it won't let go until we finish this." The canyon yawned wide as Ethan Cole and his companions studied the blasted earth, charred timbers jutting from rock like broken ribs. Amos Reed said, "This is where Crane fed the ground." Clara Monroe held her lantern high, her voice steady. "The soil's burned black, yet it breathes like a furnace." Jesse Pike kicked loose rubble, muttering, "Ain't natural. Feels like we're standing in a grave still digging itself." Ethan touched a fragment of bone and said, "These aren't legends, they're proof." The wind howled low, carrying the stench of sulfur, and Amos whispered, "The pass has memory, and Crane's carved it open." Clara glanced at Ethan, her eyes sharp. "If this curse is bound to Crane, then he must bleed for it." Ethan's jaw tightened, scar pale. "Then the curse is chained to him and every man who follows him." Jesse drew his pistol and said, "Then let's cut the chain." The ground rumbled faintly, reminding them the earth itself was listening. That night in a shuttered barn, Ethan Cole sharpened his blade under lantern glow, shadows tall as gallows. Clara Monroe paced, her voice trembling. "Ethan, someone close has been feeding Crane." Jesse Pike froze, eyes narrowing. "You saying one of us?" Amos Reed exhaled, shoulders sagging. "Secret's been walking with us since the start." Ethan looked hard at Jesse, then Amos, saying, "If there's a traitor, we smoke him out tonight." Clara said, "I saw a message slipped to a rider, marked with our trail." Jesse growled, "If you think I'd sell us, you don't know me." Ethan held up a hand, saying, "Trust is all we've got, but it's fraying." Amos muttered, "Fraying ropes break the quickest." Clara stopped, eyes wet with firelight. "One of us is breaking this family, and Crane will gut us for it." Silence pressed as heavy as chains, and the lantern hissed low. By morning, the air turned colder as Malcolm Vance strode into the square, Crane's enforcer with eyes like iron nails. He said, "Cole's a walking curse, and Crane demands his blood." Ethan Cole stepped forward, saying, "You'll find my blood won't come cheap." "Aye." Malcolm smirked, drawing his revolver. "It never does." Jesse Pike snarled, "Try me first, bastard." Clara Monroe raised her chin, steady as steel. You'll have to crawl over me to reach him. Amos Reed planted his cane in the dirt, voice hard. Merciless men fall hardest when pride leads. Malcolm laughed. Pride's all I've got, old man. The townsfolk scattered, fear shaking their steps, as tension split the air like a stretched rope ready to snap. Ethan's hand hovered near his gun, his scar burning, and he said, "End it here or choke on Crane's leash." Malcolm grinned wider. "Oh, I plan to end it." After Malcolm's challenge, Ethan Cole sat alone by the creek, face shadowed by dusk. He whispered, "I've carried this weight too long." Clara Monroe approached, her voice breaking. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore." Ethan's hand trembled as he touched the scar on his cheek, saying, "Every ghost I left behind finds me here." Clara knelt beside him, pressing her palm over his. "Then let me fight them too." Jesse Pike stood back, silent, staring into the dark trees as if listening for betrayal. Amos Reed lowered onto a rock, muttering, "Truth don't just cut, it heals if you let it." Ethan's eyes burned. "If I fall, you'll be buried with me." Clara said, "If you fall, I'll drag you back until you stand." The creek whispered around them, carrying fragments of moonlight, and for a heartbeat Ethan felt the weight ease. That night, fire lit the canyon edge as Crane's men torched a wagon, smoke billowing. Clara Monroe cried out, "No," and rushed toward it, but Ethan Cole grabbed her arm. "It's too late." From the flames, a scream tore, the love interest cut down by Crane's cruelty, left as ash in the fire. Ethan staggered, rage and grief twisting together. "He used her to break me." Jesse Pike cursed, firing into the dark. "Crane's gonna pay with more than blood." Amos Reed's voice cracked like old timber. "This is the sacrifice that carves destiny." Clara sank to her knees, sobbing. "She believed in you, Ethan." Ethan stared into the fire, scar glistening with sweat and tears, whispering, "Then I'll finish this for her." The flames roared higher, the canyon walls glowing like an open wound, sealing the vow with fire and ash. The canyon winds howled like a choir of ghosts as Ethan Cole sat by the dying fire, eyes hollow with grief. Clara Monroe pressed his hand, whispering, "Her death wasn't in vain." Ethan's voice cracked. "It was meant to break me, but it won't." Jesse Pike paced the dirt, his bandaged shoulder stiff, and said, "We either strike first or get buried in Crane's shadow." Amos Reed leaned heavy on his cane, muttering, "Fire purifies, boy, but it also consumes the man who carries it." Ethan stood, scar shining pale in the firelight, and said, "Crane thinks he took my soul. He only sharpened it." Clara's gaze softened, her lantern trembling. "Then we use that fire against him." Jesse grinned darkly. "We burn his empire until the bones of Eagle Pass are free." Ethan clenched his fists, the weight of loss hardening into resolve, and said, "At dawn, the reckoning begins." The flames hissed low, sealing his vow in smoke. The sun rose blood-red over the town, casting the streets in copper light. Jesse Pike strapped his gun belt, muttering, "Feels like my bones are finally ready for war." Clara Monroe tightened her satchel, saying, "Hope rides with us, though it's a fragile beast." Ethan Cole loaded his revolver, voice steady. "Crane wanted me broken. Now hell see me unchained." Amos Reed placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, murmuring, "Remember, the past takes more than it gives." Jesse smirked. "Then we'll take more from Crane than he ever dreamed." The townsfolk peeked from shuttered windows, whispering, their fear and expectation pressing like heat. Clara's eyes caught Ethan's, and she said, "No turning back now." Ethan answered, "I never turned back, only forward into fire." The echo of spurs across the dirt rang like drums of war. Inside the courthouse, Silas Crane stood before his men, coat pressed, eyes gleaming with hunger. He said, "Today the land itself bends to me." Malcolm Vance leaned on the wall, smirking. "Cole's coming. Hell die screaming." Crane's silver watch chain glittered, and he said, "Let him come. His fate was written when he crossed me." Ethan Cole burst through the doors with Clara Monroe, Jesse Pike, and Amos Reed at his side. Ethan's voice rang like thunder. "Your curse ends here." Crane spread his arms wide, laughing. "You think one broken soldier can bury me?" Jesse barked. "Not one soldier, a family." Clara raised her lantern defiantly, and Amos Reed growled, "A family bound in blood and truth." Crane sneered, "Then you'll all die together." The air vibrated with rage, justice, and inevitable bloodshed. Gunfire ripped the silence, bullets splintering wood. Amos Reed shoved Clara aside, cane dropping as a shot tore through his chest. He staggered, gasping, "Keep the fight alive." Ethan Cole caught him, shouting, "Stay with me, old man." Amos' eyes dimmed, whispering, "My time's done, yours begins." Jesse Pike roared, firing wild, "You bastards killed him." Clara knelt beside Amos, sobbing, "We need you." Amos smiled faint, blood staining his beard, "You already have me in your strength." Another shot cracked the air, forcing Ethan to rise, fury carving him into stone. He growled. Crane just signed his death warrant. Amos' hand fell lifeless, and silence cut sharp before gunfire resumed. The old mentor was gone, leaving fire in their chests. By nightfall, the courthouse smoldered with broken glass and blood on its floor. Ethan Cole stood over Amos Reed's empty cane, saying, "He gave his life so would carry the torch." Clara Monroe wiped tears, whispering, "We'll honor him by ending Crane." Jesse Pike holstered his smoking pistol, muttering, "I'll carve his name into every bullet until it's done." Ethan looked at the horizon, fire painting his scar, and said, "Tomorrow, we ride for Eagle Pass itself." Clara's eyes shone fierce. "Then tomorrow, we bury the curse with Crane." Jesse spat into the dirt, smirking despite blood, "And we'll make the earth remember our names." The silence of the dead pressed close, but their resolve burned brighter. Ethan whispered, "The reckoning begins at dawn." Dawn split over Eagle Pass, the sky bleeding red as Ethan Cole rode at the front, Clara Monroe and Jesse Pike at his side. The canyon walls loomed like jagged tombstones, and Ethan whispered, "This is where it ends." Clara's eyes locked on him steady. "Then let's make sure it ends right." Jesse checked his revolver, muttering, "Crane's going to choke on his own curse." The ground shook faintly, the air heavy with sulfur, and Amos Reed's cane strapped across Ethan's saddle rattled like a ghostly reminder. Ethan's jaw set hard, voice steady, "We ride not for vengeance, but for the truth this land deserves." The canyon swallowed their footsteps, shadows waiting like open graves. At the canyon floor, Silas Crane waited with Malcolm Vance and armed men, fanned out like vultures. Crane raised his hand, voice booming, "Cole, this land bows to me." Ethan Cole dismounted, boots grinding stone, and said, "No man owns what bleeds." Clara Monroe stood behind, her lantern flame unshaken. "Your empire is built on bones, and it's crumbling." Jesse Pike snarled, "Let's tear it down." Malcolm Vance drew his blade, smirking, "I'll gut the fight out of you." Ethan's hand hovered near his revolver, scar twitching, then step closer and see how it feels. The canyon wind screamed between them, as if urging blood to fall. Gunfire cracked first. Jesse Pike fired at Malcolm, who lunged, blade flashing. Clara Monroe shouted, "Ethan," as Crane pulled his revolver with icy calm. Ethan Cole rolled, firing back, sparks ricocheting off stone. Malcolm slashed Jesse's arm, but Jesse grit his teeth, yelling, "Not enough to stop me." Clara swung her lantern at a gunman, glass shattering fire across the dirt. Ethan squared on Crane, eyes burning, and said, "Every lie dies with you." Crane smirked cold, "Then shoot. Cole, if you dare carry that curse forever." Their shots thundered at the same time, echoing like judgment. Malcolm fell, chest pierced, and Jesse Pike stumbled but grinned, "Told you I'd outlast him." Clara Monroe dragged him aside, whispering, "Stay with me." Ethan Cole and Silas Crane faced each other alone, revolvers smoking, eyes locked like wolves. Crane said, "You'll never wash the blood off." Ethan answered, "It was never mine. It's yours." Crane fired, but Ethan's shot struck true first, blasting the mayor off his feet. Crane gasped, blood pooling, whispering, "The land was mine." Ethan loomed over him, saying, "The land forgives no man." Crane's eyes went glassy, his curse buried with him. Silence dropped heavy, broken only by Jesse's ragged breath. By dusk, the canyon lay still, fire and smoke drifting into the night sky. Clara Monroe leaned on Ethan Cole, whispering, "It's over." Jesse Pike laughed weakly, "Over for now." Ethan stared at Amos Reed's cane planted in the dirt, saying, "He carried us here, and we finished it." Clara's eyes glistened. "Eagle Pass will heal, those scars never fade." Ethan looked to the horizon, voice low but steady. "Sometimes the land don't forgive, but it remembers who stood." The last light bled from the sky, sealing their story into legend, leaving only the echo of gunfire and the silence of survival.